Good morning. This is Pastor Ernie Lewis of the Blue Point Church in Sisney, Illinois, with your thoughts for Wednesday. This week we are looking at the prayer that Paul prays for the church at Colossae in Colossians chapter 1. He says in verse 9, "For this reason, we also, since the day we heard of it, do not cease to pray for you and to ask that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will in all wisdom and spiritual understanding." It is exciting to me that Paul and his traveling companions and all the work that they have to do in ministering and preaching the gospel and starting churches as missionaries, they have devoted themselves to pray for new converts. Here, it is for those that they don't even know, but they've heard about in Colossae. And Paul says, we are going to pray without ceasing since the day we heard of your faith in the gospel. The idea of praying without ceasing is something that Paul told the church at Thessalonica that they needed to do in all things, to pray without ceasing. And he has also written in his New Testament epistle to the Romans that he would pray for them without ceasing. To the church at Thessalonica that he would pray for them without ceasing. And even to young Timothy in one of his epistles to him, I will pray without ceasing. That is a grave task to undertake. Praying for someone without ceasing. Oftentimes we get distracted. Maybe we take on other prayer requests that seem so urgent and crucial right now. Or sometimes we neglect to follow up with someone's prayer request and we neglect them and forget to pray. But to pray without ceasing for those believers that he didn't even know, this is so impressive. And I'm sure God heard his prayers and I'm sure he honored them too and answered them as Paul prayed them. What a wonderful practice to pray continually, especially for new Christians as they begin their journey. It's almost like standing beside the running track and catching one of those runners that has started this really long and arduous race and cheering them along. Keep it up. Come on. Keep up your pace. Especially keep up to the very end. That's the way our prayers should be for new converts whenever we pray without ceasing. And his first request here is that he prays that they would be filled with the knowledge of God's will for their lives. You know, it's easy to get sidetracked sometimes, especially with our own ideas or maybe our own plans, how we would like for our lives to go rather than what God's will is for them. And yet we know God's will is so important. We know that God's will is the best for us. If we would follow it, so much better than our plans. So he prays that they would have all the knowledge of God's will necessary for keeping on track, for running the race for God's glory. He also prays that they would have the knowledge of God's will in all wisdom. Now, wisdom is that wonderful gift that God gives us to be able to apply the knowledge that we have correctly. James says, if any of you lacks wisdom, just ask of God because he gives to all men liberally. So we need to pray for this wisdom. And Paul prays for their spiritual understanding. You know, we often have our own carnal understanding. That'll lead us astray. That will cause us to turn away from God's will and want to do what we want. But spiritual understanding here teaches us what is acceptable and desirable in our thoughts, in our actions for every instance or every circumstance that we find ourselves in. And Paul is praying without ceasing for their knowledge and their understanding of God's will. You know, we need to be praying that for ourselves, don't we? We need to be praying, God, give me all the knowledge and the wisdom that I need in order to do your will every day in my life.